warm welcome to you all to this webinar, Greening Our Finances, Practical Steps for Eco-Churches. My name's Rosie Venner. I work for the JustMoney movement, and on behalf of all those who've been involved in organising today's webinar, including friends at Eco-Church and Operation Noah, I want to thank you very much for joining us. It's been really encouraging to see the interest that there's been in this webinar, the thoughtful and wide-ranging questions that some of you've asked in advance, and the breadth of churches that you represent. So do take some time to introduce yourselves to each other in the chat as we go along. And because there are so many of us, we will keep everyone muted, but the chat is open for you to ask questions and to make comments, and particularly ask you to ask your questions as we get to the Q&A nearer the end. So today's webinar is about helping local churches explore climate action and creation care. But I just need to give a quick disclaimer that it does not involve the provision of financial advice. So if you do wish to receive advice, whether that's for you as an individual or on behalf of your church, then please consult a qualified and independent financial advisor. So if you can have the next slide, and I'll talk you through what we're going to cover today. We have quite a lot of ground to cover. This is a really rich and wide-ranging topic. We'll be hearing from a number of speakers and from local churches taking action. There'll be lots of information to digest, but don't worry, today's webinar is being recorded, and we'll be sending out a link to the recording later this week with the slides and links to resources that are mentioned by the speakers. Today's webinar is taking place during Good Money Week, which runs from the 6th to the 12th of October in the lead up to Good Money Sunday this weekend, which is an opportunity for churches to join in with wider movements across civil society who are interested and passionate about making more ethical, sustainable financial choices that are good for people and planet. And many of us have also been marking the season of creation, or are in the midst of harvest celebrations or the preparation for those. So we thought that this was the perfect time to delve a bit more deeply into the ways we can steward our resources in ways that are good news for creation. So we'll be hearing in a moment first from Helen Stevens to set the context and talk a little bit more about money and finance in the Eco-Church survey and why take action. Then you'll hear from me again on greener banking and campaigning for change around actions that individuals and churches can take. Then we'll hear from Clare Fussell from Operation Noah about divestment and about investing in climate solutions. And then there'll be an opportunity to hear from local churches and the actions that they are taking. And I'd encourage all of you, if you're involved locally in work towards an Eco-Church award or in other ways in creation care and taking action with your finances, then do share examples of that, do share stories of that in the chat, because that will be really encouraging and helpful for all of us to hear. And then, as I said, there'll be time for Q&A before we wrap up, and we'll have a quick feedback poll at the end, because it's really helpful for us to know what are the issues that you really want to hear more about, what resources and support would help you. We will scratch the surface of this really big topic today, and so would really welcome your thoughts on what we could do as a follow-up to this webinar. And then we'll be finishing at 1:45. So yeah, once again, really warm welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm delighted to hand over to our first speaker, Helen Stevens from Rocha UK, who's going to set today's topic in context. I think most of you on the call will be familiar with the amazing Eco-Church scheme, which helps churches of all denominations evaluate how they're caring for God's creation across all their activities and gives guidance on how to become more sustainable. But I'll let Helen explain a little more. Thank you, Helen.
Thank you so much, Rosie, for your introduction and also for the chance to be part of this webinar today, which I'm really delighted that we're holding. And I'm delighted as part of Eco-Church and Rocha UK to be doing this alongside the JustMoney movement and Operation Noah, who bring particular expertise to this vast area, as Rosie has said. My role for today, really, I think, is to provide an overall framing of money in the context of Eco-Church. And then Rosie and Clare in particular will provide some very practical steps of what churches can do. I know, and Rosie has said, many of you are attending from registered and awarded Eco-Churches, and I can see that in the chat. but especially for those who are less familiar, I'm going to do a quick overview to give you the broader context. But let me start by telling you very briefly about Rocha UK, which is the organisation that runs EcoChurch. Rocha is Portuguese for the rock, in case you're wondering how we came to have an unusual name, because it started in Portugal in the 80s, and Rocha in the UK has been going since 2001. And this is what we're about, as you can see on the slide. We're a Christian charity working to protect and restore the natural world and committed to equipping Christians and churches to care for the environment. And we do that through various programs. We have Partners in Action, which is our work with Christian landowners and managers. And then Wild Christian, which is our program for individuals and households. And then, of course, EcoChurch, which is more of the context for today. So what is EcoChurch? Well, launched nearly 10 years ago now. It's our 10th anniversary next year. It was designed as a scheme to mobilise churches to care for God's earth, and it's become a community of learning and engagement, and part of a bigger movement of the church taking creation care more seriously and beginning to integrate it as a core part of mission. So there's an holistic EcoChurch survey covering 5 foundational categories of church life and providing a framework for action across all those areas of church life. It's always been about encouraging churches to record what they are already doing, reflect on the further steps that they can take, and then act accordingly. And the awards serve this well because they provide great opportunities for churches to celebrate, share, and find the motivation to carry on to the next step in what can sometimes feel like an uphill struggle. And our churches rely so much on volunteers across all areas of church life. So that celebration is important, I think. Coming on to national numbers, just very quickly. There are now over 8,800 registered churches on the next slide, and over 4,500 of which have received a bronze or silver award, including now well over 100 golds. That's since 2016, so it does take quite a lot of work to get there. Coming on to the ethos, just very briefly, of EcoChurch, while it is an award scheme, the awards are not ends in themselves. It's about providing that framework for churches to think about, increase their understanding, and take action to embed caring for the earth across every aspect of church life, whatever the context. And we serve an increasingly diverse church. We've got over 20 denominations now registered on the EcoChurch platform. Just to highlight on the next slide briefly a bit about our ethos and our emphasis. I've mentioned the diverse church base. The whole survey really is addressing the recognition that we have the twin crises of climate change and the loss of nature, and implicitly many other environmental issues that we face, that we cannot ask questions on everything, but that's the overall ethos and approach of the survey. We really want churches to own the survey. It's designed to be interpreted in its local context with integrity and aligned with the overall spirit of the questions. And then really what we're looking for is a church embedding and sustaining action for the long term. So this is really about encouraging, influencing and building on the positive, trying to influence long-term behavioural and cultural change, rather than penalising churches for what they're not doing. I want to come on to the categories. They'll be, I'm sure, very familiar to some of you and perhaps less so to others, but let me do this in the context of money. All these categories are mutually reinforcing. Let me say that up front. The more that we learn about God, the maker and sustainer of the universe, no less, and learn about who we are and whose we are, a part of creation, not apart from it, then I think the more we'll be inspired and encouraged to care for this earth and walk in Jesus's footsteps. His challenge to the money changers in the temple has no less resonance and meaning in how we use and manage our buildings today. Then the ways that we're taking action in our churches through community and global engagement, which I will say look more about, how we're speaking up, managing our finances, transport, waste, influencing our personal lives as well, really asks the question, how is there a thread of caring for the whole world across the whole of our church and lives? Thinking specifically about money. So when we reviewed the Eco Church survey last year, and we did pretty much a root and branch review of the whole thing, we wanted to ensure that churches are being encouraged to take the most impactful actions. And we'd long identified that this growing area of ethical and green finance was one that we wanted to strengthen, along with lots of other areas. So we've included specific questions on money to reflect the extent to which money, how we save, spend, and invest it, has such influence on our lives. We understand that what we do with our money on multiple levels, and especially in our choice of banks and investment, can have a significant impact on the world for good or ill. And where these institutions that we might support continue to finance fossil fuels, then obviously a direct impact on climate change, as well as many other environmental and societal impacts. So while we've intentionally included specific questions about money in two of the survey categories, which I will say more about shortly, our attitudes to money and our use of it are integrated across the whole of Eco Church, whether we consciously think this or not. Let me start with worship and teaching, which is foundational to Eco Church. We worship a God, as I've said, who loves everything that he has made and calls us to care for it. And doing so is a part of our witness and worship. And our attitudes to money reveal much about our attitudes to God and the world. There are many passages in the Bible that relate to this important topic, but one that comes to mind for me is Matthew 21:12, that of Jesus throwing the money changers out of the temple. And it says this: Jesus entered the temple courts and drove out all who were buying and selling there. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the benches of those selling doves. It is written, he said to them, my house will be called a house of prayer, but you are making it a den of robbers. Pilgrims coming to Jerusalem needed to purchase sacrifices and thus exchange the currency for what was acceptable as a temple tax, but this had become exploitative. I know it's quite a stark image, but whereas the money changers' activities were visible and likely harboured dishonest or unlawful profit, where our church money is invested or going to is often far less visible. Unless we've made a conscious choice to bank and invest ethically, then we simply don't know. So a good starting point in any of this, I think, is to find out. And we can, of course, and should pray that we would make wise and just choices with money as part of our corporate witness and our discipleship. Let me briefly mention two other categories of Eco Church before spending a bit more focused time on the other two. So buildings and energy, we've, because of our increasingly diverse church base, when we changed the survey, we created three pathways through this category. For cathedrals and churches that are used regularly, to churches without their own buildings that may meet in rented space or even outdoors. Many of these questions relate more to the maintenance and fabric of buildings and actions to reduce our energy footprint. And clearly there are often choices here about how much we might invest in carbon reduction measures, how we manage our buildings, and the people and the activities that we host. So many of these areas contain monetary and wider ethical choices, but as I said before, they just might not be so intentionally written in that way, but if you delve into them, they are. If we pause just for a minute to think about how much attention there is on carbon reduction measures and plans for net zero across our building estate, with many denominations committed to and leading on this work, what we do with our money in terms of banking and investment can have a similar impact. Very briefly, I'm going to say the least on this, but land and nature, which is the third category, there are questions here about how we prioritise our time and money spent caring for land and nature. Land management and financial decisions around this are more in focus as part of our denominational awards, such as through Eco Diocese. And I know there are some of you on the call today from diocese, and certainly I think we will look at how we can explore that further, maybe in another webinar. but I hope today is useful too in this more local parish context. Coming on to community and global engagement, the fourth category, the climate and nature crises, as we know, are so profoundly unjust and affect those who've done the least to cause these crises. And that applies as much as in our own country as across the wider world. It is often the poorest, the most disadvantaged, who have the least access to green spaces, who are most affected by air pollution. And also, I am very aware, may have the fewest choices about where and how they can access money, let alone make choices around the ethics of this. There is, though, in this section, as in every category, and I should have said that, an all-important upfront commitment, which is not it's not a compulsory question or a prescriptive question, but it is right at the start of each category asking us as a church to recognise the implications in these different categories. Wherever you are on your journey with social and political engagement, though, this category is an invitation to take the next step, whether that looks like starting a conversation in your church, joining local events, engaging in issues of justice, campaigning for nature. And while there's much we can do as a church body, our impact will be even greater when we work with others to bring about local and global change. So look at the expertise, skills, and knowledge that already exist in your wider community, including on this important issue of money. So there are questions in here about engaging with others. And there are many myriad ways that we can take action, from attending an MP's surgery and maybe raising issues of access to greener finance, to organising events and taking part in weeks such as this one, Good Money Week. And you might want to hold a Good Money Sunday as part of Good Money Week. But let me just say clearly that at Rocha UK, we do strongly support and ourselves participate in campaigning and advocacy, and it is a key part of Eco Church. And this category in particular is what this is about. I want to share a specific question in this category that is front and centre about what we do with our money. So on the next slide, you'll see our church recognises that choices about how we steward our finances, including banking, pensions, the role of divestment, have a significant impact on climate change, climate and climate justice. So there are all these options here that churches can choose if they're taking part in one or any of these. So, for example, supporting anti-poverty campaigns and actions might be about addressing some of the deep inequalities in our society. JustMoney movement have a campaign on church action for tax justice. Banking with providers with robust climate and nature-friendly policies. Banks have a lot of power, and I know Rosie is going to say more about this and perhaps the Bank Well campaign. Tring High Street Bank Baptist Church, which is one of our early golds, they actually switched banks sometime after achieving their gold award. They were convinced that they needed to do that from an ethical perspective, but it took them a while to research their needs and take the plunge. And there was some anxiety about losing those who may be making the switch while they were changing direct debits and standing orders. But actually, they promoted it as review your giving, and many more signed up to give regularly. And it's partly about the timing of these things. They were able to dovetail the closing of one account and the reopening of a new one. And then just very briefly on this next one, don't invest in funds with an interest in fossil fuels. Beulah United Reformed Church in Cardiff, which was the first church to divest back in 2019. Ethical finance was one of the issues highlighted in their Think of the Alternative exhibition. And you can look on their website for, they highlight links to the Just Money movement. So a creative approach there through an exhibition and ultimately divestment. You will find resources on our website. In particular, can I draw your attention to the overview documents that we have for each category? And in the community and global engagement overview document, there's a reference in there to the Green Investment Declaration, an initiative from Operation Noah and JustMoney, which I think we'll hear more about later. So I won't say any more on that now, but I'm signposting these things as we do through the Eco Church survey and in our resources. Before I very briefly touch on lifestyle to finish, I actually want to share some insights from our data as to how churches are progressing with money-related actions. This is in response to that specific question that we've just looked at. And this is based on data of 320 odd bronze and silver churches these are churches getting their awards between October last year, when we released the new version of the survey, to the end of August this year. And you can see from this, I hope you can see from this, 81% of silver awarded churches are supporting anti-poverty campaigns and taking action. 44% of bronze awarded churches do not invest in funds with fossil fuels. And overall, 42% of bronze and silver awarded churches are taking action on both banking and campaigning. I do find these headlines encouraging. Yes, there's a way to go. I recognise that, I really do. But that's why we're holding webinars like today, because this is such an important area and can be quite complex. And I think we have a journey to go. So if your church is already taking some level of action on money, great, and thank you. But if there's an area that you haven't even thought about or you feel stuck, hopefully today will provide some very practical ideas. Very, very briefly, because I am slightly over time, lifestyle, by no means least, but let me just highlight here that again, there are questions in lifestyle. Maybe think of this more in terms of discipleship. This is not about telling us telling our congregations what to do, but rather encouraging one another as part of our ongoing discipleship. And there are great Bible study resources with Operation Noah and JustMoney and others that will help us to do this. But many of the questions in this category are about building on what we're already doing in our churches, hopefully, and vice versa. It's individuals in our congregations that may be really well versed in ethical finance influencing our church at a corporate level. And then through the community and global, if we share about the changes that we're making in our churches in newsletters and so on, we can encourage people in their lifestyles to be taking more action. And let me just share this statistic, which is from the Just Money movement website. If you've ever wondered what spending power you have, a church community of 40 households has a collective spending power of 1 million every year to shape a fairer, greener world. I'm sure there's a huge amount in that 1 million, and that will vary across the country, but as an average, that's the sort of impact that we can be having. I think we are pretty much out of time, so I'm not going to share the next slide, but you can go onto the website. Thanks so much. Can you commit to take one action from today, which may be simple as having a conversation with someone in your church about money? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Helen, and thank you to you and all involved in EcoChurch for the way that you are integrating money and finance and just showing that interconnectedness through all the categories. I think it's been really helpful to see how that's been developing, and I know there's lots of encouragement and ideas there for people to get involved with. I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about ways into thinking about greener banking and campaigning for change. As Helen has pointed out, banking is one area in which we can start to make greener choices. And I find it's a really helpful place to start when talking about finance, because it's something people can connect with. Most people have a bank account and have some agency around maybe their own choice of banking. But as churches, we can also think about and review our banking practices and see how they might align with the other actions that we are taking to care for God's creation. So I'll take you through a few kind of ways into thinking about why we should be taking action with our banking. First of all, some headlines. You may have seen over the last few years a kind of increase, I think, in awareness of the roles that banks play in connection to the climate crisis. So there have been headlines recently about the world's biggest banks and the UK's biggest banks' investments in fossil fuels. Last year was the first year since 2021 that banks actually increased their investments in fossil fuels. And there's been $7 trillion US of fossil fuel financing since the Paris Agreement back in 2016. So since the world committed to limit global warming, we have seen vast sums of money still pouring into fossil fuel financing. And there are other issues that we should be aware of as well. Through the loans and investments that banks make, there are other harmful sectors and activities that we may be taking action on in other parts of our eco-church journey or our own discipleship. Single-use plastics is one of those. We at Just Money ran a campaign for a couple of years to draw attention to the role that banks play in financing single-use plastic producers. As more money pours in, as individuals and as consumers, there are actions we can take, but actually we need to go back to the source of the problem. And so much of the time it links back to finance, links back to what is being funded and where loans and investments are being made. And then many of you would also be conscious of the issue of greenwashing and how difficult it is to find information. Lack of transparency is a really big issue when it comes to the banking sector, and I'll say a bit more about that later. Next slide, please. But banks play a really, really important role. As I've said, every loan and investment has an impact. We need banks and we need the services that they provide, but we need to be aware of the impact that banks have through their financing decisions, whether that's on our impact on our local communities, but also on nature, on habitat loss, on fossil fuel expansion. We need to have a greater understanding, I think, as churches of the role that banks play and the agency that we give banks when we bank with them as customers. And as this Methodist Church report, which I really would recommend to you to have a bit more of a read of, sets out actually what do we expect from banks? What would a better vision for banks be? And what can we advocate for as churches? Banks have a crucial role in the global economic response to the climate emergency. They are the ones that can really help with that managed transition away from fossil fuels to sustainable energy, because they are providing so much of the financial power behind that transition. Next slide, please. So what do we know about our banks? And I wanted to draw your attention to some very, very recent research that's just come out. So which the consumer charity released their latest research into banks and their climate policies on Friday of last week. So this is hot off the press. And I'll talk about the detail in a moment, but it confirms what we've known for a while now, that the UK's big banks are still not making enough progress on their climate commitments, and some have been actively increasing their fossil fuel financing. So I'll let you absorb some of the detail there. So they looked at a number of the big high street banks, the names that will be familiar to us, and they have highlighted these as the worst performers amongst those in terms of their fossil fuel financing, but also a range of other. I've just taken a snapshot of the research here, but they also looked at fossil fuel policies. They looked at policies around agriculture, policies around forestry, and measures of transparency, and then came up with a score taking into account all of those different areas of action or inaction around the climate. And I share this with you because I think it's sometimes difficult to find out information about what banks are involved with. Yeah, this is some really helpful and detailed research that's available freely online. If you want to look a little bit more at your bank's climate policies, then the Which research is a really helpful place to start. Next slide, please. But the good news is that there are alternatives, and there are banks that put people and planet first. So there are banks that are set up, that are purpose-driven, that are underpinned by values that mean that they are much more likely to be investing in climate solutions, investing in ways that protect God's creation. And going back to the Which research, they've identified 2 banks as their fossil fuel-free eco-providers. So they name Triodos and the Cooperative Bank. And the eagle-eyed treasurers among you may already have spotted that Co-op is the only one that actually provides a current account suitable for churches. Triodos used to, but it's paused that for now. It does offer a business and charity deposit account. current accounts for individuals, but which research only covers the big names and the names that will be mostly well known to a broad section of people, and we'll come in a bit to what other options, including smaller, more kind of ethical and specific banking options that might be available for churches. So what can we do? And I'll quickly run through this because I'm aware of the time creeping on. So one of the first things that we can do, next slide please, is to educate individuals in our churches and communities about greener banking. One way we can do that is through the Big Bank Switch, which is an ecumenical initiative encouraging Christians to move to greener banks. And I'll say more about that in a moment. Second option, and I understand this is probably the harder thing to do, but something to really try and get to grips with, is to review your church's banking. Every year we provide research in the Greener Fairer Banking Guide at JustMoney Movement, which compares the different ethical options available for churches. Again, I'll say more about that in a moment, and to encourage you to campaign with us for a fairer, greener banking sector. There are lots of ways, as Helen has said, that you can speak out, whether that's engaging with your MP or joining in with wider civil society campaigns that are holding banks to account. But I just want to highlight two of those options that you can do. There's two actions that you can take. So the first, the Big Bank Switch, would encourage you to share information about the Big Bank Switch with your congregation, with your community, encourage people to check their current bank, to make a pledge to switch, and really importantly, tell their bank why they're switching away. And we are really encouraging as many Christians as possible to take part in the Big Bank Switch, because people moving en masse is really helpful to tell that story. It helps with our engagement with the bigger banks to talk to them about why people are moving, and it's a way of championing banks that are behaving in green ways. And secondly, for churches, I'm not going to go into huge detail here. We can pick this up a bit more in the Q&A, and I can share the link to the Greener Fairer Banking Guide. But we look at 4 of the more ethical options available for churches. So CAF Bank, the Cooperative Bank I've already mentioned, Reliance Bank, which is the Salvation Army's bank, and Unity Trust. And within that, we look at lots of different ethical kind of frameworks and research, but we also look at their climate commitments. So if you're looking and reviewing your church finances and you're wanting to find a church to switch to, maybe away from one of the big high street banks, then I encourage you to have a look at the Greener Fairer Banking Guide to find more information there. Next slide. And then I'll hand over. We really want to make sure that we're making a bigger noise about the fact that churches are moving away from less climate friendly banks. And one way you can do this is through Bankwell. This is an initiative that's been set up by Just Love UK and JustMoney Movement to share learning from across the UK of churches that are making the switch, to share learning and to encourage each other. So that if this is something that you're wanting to do locally to start a conversation about switching, then there is training and support available from Bankwell to help you start that conversation with your church. I'm at time now, so I'm going to now hand over to Clare from Operation Noah, who's going to talk to us a little bit more about investments. Over to you, Clare.
Thank you so much, Rosie, and really great to be here with you all today. My name's Clare Fussell and I'm the campaign director at Operation Noah. But I'm also involved in an eco church in Bristol that we've received our gold award last year, which we're very proud of. And yeah, great to be with fellow eco church people today. So we've been talking a bit about greener banking for individuals and for local churches, but now I'm going to talk a bit more about the wealth of wider church institutions at a denominational level or at a diocesan level within the C of E, and how that could be used to help tackle the climate crisis. So Operation Noah is an ecumenical Christian charity that exists to inspire the church to take greater action on the climate crisis. And so we support all Christian denominations, and we're involved in interfaith work as well on climate change to try and provide some leadership and inspiration on the growing threat of catastrophic climate change. And we've been campaigning on fossil fuel divestment for the past decade. And if we move to the next slide, Many of you may have been involved in this, in getting your church bodies to divest from fossil fuels. And over that time, the share of renewables in our energy system, at least in Europe and across Africa, has hugely increased. And the good news is that now in many places it's over 50% of our total energy mix. But at the same time, oil and gas companies show no sign of slowing their activity. And I have some figures here. According to research by Global Witness, about 4.9 trillion US dollars will be spent by oil and gas companies on exploring and extracting from new fields over the next decade. And that is, of course, not in any way compatible with the Paris Agreement. And furthermore, the International Energy Forum estimate that 4.3 trillion of upstream oil and gas investment will be required just over the next 5 years alone to meet the growth in demand. So we still have an uphill battle. Influence Map reports that the 5 biggest publicly traded oil and gas companies also spend about $200 million a year on lobbying specifically aimed at controlling, delaying, or blocking binding climate motivated policy. So there's still a strong tide to continue extracting and expanding with fossil fuels. But in that same context of greenwashing and misleading, we know that churches have a strong role to play, and we've had a really successful divestment campaign led by Operation Noah, whereby almost all churches in the UK have now divested from fossil fuel companies. And Helen gave some really great examples just now of how eco churches have been involved in that campaign over the years. But we still want churches to be taking a leading role in the national debate on the ethics of investment in fossil fuels, calling out where other institutions are investing in fossil fuels still, and supporting the development of clear alternatives through their investment policies, which I will talk a little bit more about. So if you move to the next slide. A couple of years ago, we published a report on church investment in climate solutions. And in that, we shared that if the world redirected the $570 billion of annual planned oil and gas investments towards renewables, then this could fully finance wind and solar energy expansion in line with the 1.5 degree C target of the Paris Agreement. While a couple of years later, this is looking increasingly difficult to achieve, it still isn't entirely out of the question. We know that we've passed that 1.5 degree C boundary in the last couple of years, but we also know that exceeding this temperature in just a single year doesn't mean that the target has failed. It's an average over time. But every 1/10 of a degree matters, and we really need to continue taking urgent action to reverse warming trends. And as faith bodies, we can play an important role in this transition, because globally combined, faith institutions manage around $3 trillion, which is a huge amount and has huge potential to shape the world that we want to see, not only through those direct investments and where that money is being held, but through churches speaking up and making the moral case for wider movement of money into climate solutions. So we need to harness that power and influence that churches have in our wider societies and not stay silent on this really important issue. Which is why last year we teamed up with our friends at JustMoney Movement and Faith Invest as well to launch this Green Investment Declaration. And it's designed as a tool to help churches and faith institutions to take some practical steps to better align their investments with their faith values, and then ultimately use this money to have real impact in building a better world, specifically in this case, in tackling climate change. So the declaration asks churches and faith groups to do 3 things. Firstly, to make a plan to invest more in climate solutions. So make sure you have an investment policy, and in it that you state that this is something that's important to you as a church and something that you intend to increase and commit to over time. Secondly, to start making investments that have a positive impact, looking at where you're currently invested, having those conversations with your fund managers about the mix of investments if you are investing in pooled funds, and whether that can increase its investments in solutions that help tackle the climate crisis, whether that be renewable energy or nature-based solutions like forestry and sustainable farming. And then thirdly, to communicate this. As I said earlier, we can't stay silent on this issue, and we really need to be speaking up and showing moral leadership and opening up space for other organisations and individuals to follow suit and to have these conversations. Everyone was invited to share a question before this webinar, and one of the questions was, does charity law allow churches to spend more on green solutions? Which is an excellent question, and the answer is yes. And recently, charity law has changed. There's a real clear precedent now for UK church bodies to consider environmental concerns in their investments beyond a narrow financial fiduciary duty. And that's following a 2022 High Court ruling known as the Butler-Sloss versus the Charity Commission. So you can sort of look that up online. And it clarified that churches and charities can adopt ethical investment policies that exclude environmentally damaging sectors and prioritise green investments, even if this might mean sacrificing some potential financial return. And the Charity Commission guidance on this was updated in 2023 to reflect this kind of new legal framework. So the answer is yes, there's nothing to stop you as a church from taking this action. So if we go to the next slide, if we briefly have a look at, well, this is a fantastic quote from one of our signatories from the Society of the Holy Child Jesus, who said that the reason they signed up to be part of this initiative is because it's so important to them that the investments, like all their resources, are in line with the guiding principles of the enhancement of human dignity and the care of our common home and the values that flow from this: justice, peace, and compassion. And I think that's just such a fantastic example of why it is that we need to care about this as churches and people of faith. So on the next slide, it will show you the 3 levels of the declaration. You don't already need to be whizzes in green investment already to be part of this. There's Acorn level, at which signatories just need to make a commitment to start investing in climate solutions within the next couple of years. Then it moves up to sapling level, where you start to make and communicate these investments and have plans for the future. And at Oak level, signatories would have already invested at least 5% of their assets in climate solutions and be committing to increase this over time. So it's designed to be a journey that as your investments grow, you move up through the initiative. And there's a real sense of peer learning and support with this as well, whereby signatories can come alongside each other and create a bit of a community of practice of those who are starting to think about how their investments are used in this way. So on the next slide, there is a, oh yes, so great. Why now? Why publicly? Why collectively? I feel like we've answered some of these questions already, that there is an urgent need to end the expansion of coal, oil and gas and finance a fast energy transition. The movement provides peer learning and opportunities to share. And as I've mentioned a couple of times, public voice is so important in building momentum amongst faith communities. And there's a suite of materials on the next slide to help you to raise this issue within your church. So whether that be at a local church level or diocese, district, synod, conference, depending on what church you're in, please do take this question to them and ask them to make the commitment to start moving more funds into climate solutions. And we have a suite of materials on the website with toolkits and sample letters and service material, service like liturgies and prayers, just to engage in lots of different ways to help churches to think this through. And I think if you go on to the next slide, there's some more examples there. Yes, there's some images there of some of the materials that are available. So I would really encourage you to get involved in the campaign, sign up to find out more, and we can be in touch and guide you through the process. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claire. Really, really good to hear more about the practical support that's available, as well as, and also, yeah, I think the examples and case studies of those that are already on the journey towards investing in climate solutions are going to be really helpful as well. We've heard about lots of different ways that churches can take action to align their finances and their care for creation. But what does it look like in practice? How do we get started? How do we overcome challenges or barriers? I'm really pleased to be able to invite Caroline Harmon, who's going to join me now in conversation about what she's been doing in her church and some of the some of the things that they've been involved with locally. I had hoped to have someone else in conversation, but they've not been able to join us. But I'm really, really excited to have Caroline with us. If we can have the slides off the screen for now, I think then we can. Yeah, there we go. Yeah. So, Caroline, thanks so much for being willing to share a little bit about your experience. I think it'll be really helpful for people to hear. Could I ask you just to start with just giving a really quick introduction to your church and its context and something about the steps that you've been taking?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so I'm the Eco Church team lead, which is a voluntary position within Open Heaven Church. So we're part of the Pioneer Network, which is a network of charismatic churches across the UK. And about 2 years ago, we decided to switch some of our savings account to an ethical bank. So a bank that doesn't invest in fossil fuels. That was sort of the top thing we were looking for. And it was something that I'd been sort of banging on about for a little while, but we had an opportunity where our trustees wanted to change the savings accounts anyway. So we just thought, well, while we're doing that anyway, let's take the opportunity to get away from fossil fuels at the same time.
Great, thank you. And what prompted you and your church to start looking at ways to green your finances? Has it been part of your Eco Church journey? Why did you choose to look at banking?
I think that for a long time, there's been a concern about creation care amongst the members of our church. And there were people who, quite a lot of years ago thought about who they were banking with. But since 2021, we've been journeying with Eco Church, and we most recently achieved Silver Award back in January. So obviously, when you're doing Eco Church, you're looking at lots of different things, aren't you? Helen showed us those 5 different areas. But the thing that I got most excited about was switching our bank, just because of the high impact it has in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So I know it's sort of not as visible or tangible as solar panels or a vegetable patch or bird boxes or whatever, but the impact is huge. And I think often for a lot of organisations, what you do with your money is where you can have the biggest impact in reducing carbon emissions and reducing that footprint. So that's why I got quite excited about it.
Yeah, and I think it's that still quite hidden, quite unknown thing, isn't it? People don't often think of it front and centre as like, okay, that's the way I can take action. Awareness is growing. And you've obviously taken that action to switch as a church. Can you tell us a bit more about how you've been encouraging individuals to take action too? Because there's obviously that power in educating and raising awareness, telling the story.
So telling the story, I think that's the thing, because it is less visible than some things you do on the Eco Church journey. So when we announced to the whole church one Sunday morning that we had switched that account, we took the opportunity to also say, and that is something you can do as an individual, and we directed them to places where they could find out about fossil fuel investments with banks. So it's been mentioned in that way on a Sunday morning. It's mentioned on the Eco Church page of our website. It's just something I try to bring up anytime we talk about the church finances, that actually you could do this at home as well with your personal finances.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Caroline. I didn't previously give you any other hints of what you could talk about, but I wonder if I can ask you just one more question, which is just around what might you do next? Is there anything that you're thinking about doing next in that whole big kind of possible spectrum of finance related things within the Eco Church service? Is there something you've got your eye on?
Yes, so we've done our savings accounts. We haven't actually we've talked about, but not quite got all the way there yet with our not savings accounts, but our day-to-day accounts. And so I guess there's always that kind of the barrier when I kept mentioning it initially was, but it might be administratively, a bit of a pain and a bit, it just creates issues as you do it, does it? So that's, I think, why we started with our savings, and then we'll move on to our day-to-day accounts. And obviously we could also look at things like staff pensions as well. That's something we haven't got onto yet, but would like to look at.
Wonderful. Well, all the best.
We also found, I know Clare mentioned just then putting kind of ethical considerations or green considerations above financial, and that being okay in charity law. We actually found that we got a better interest rate, as it happened, in switching to an ethical savings account. So it isn't always the case that you end up with a worse situation financially. We actually benefited there in the end, which our trustees were very happy about.
And I think you can also see that if you're switching to a green and more ethical bank, there are other justice issues, other ethical issues that might help with in terms of persuading your church, other things you might be already working on, campaigning on, things like financial inclusion.
Often, if a bank isn't investing in fossil fuels, they're also not investing in the arms trade or companies with a bad human rights record or tobacco. And those might be issues that some people in the church really care about as well.
Yeah, so there's that interconnectedness. Caroline, thank you so much. Really appreciate you coming and just giving us a flavour of what you're doing locally. I think that's really helpful for people to hear. I'm going to invite Claire and Helen to come back onto the screen now. I'll take the spotlight off you, Caroline, unless you want to come back in, you're really welcome to. And we've got time now for a kind of wider conversation and Q&A. There have been some questions going into the chat, so let me just bring Claire and Helen back in, and we can pick up on some of the things that have been coming up so far. We've tried, as we've gone along, to answer questions that came in advance. We've tried to incorporate those within the presentations, but I'm aware that there might be follow-up questions that you have, and others who didn't have a chance to submit a question beforehand that would like to ask something else. So just going to have a little quick look at what has come in as we've been speaking. And yeah, please do take the time now to ask anything that you'd like further clarification about, or if you'd like to have, to pose a question for one of the speakers. So there's a question there, which I'll pick up first, because actually we haven't touched on that at all, and it's about pensions. There's a question there about, I'm interested personally in how to get my private pension platform to improve their ethical funds. What advice is there out there? So that's really great. I mean, we haven't touched on pensions today, but obviously there's a huge amount of money in UK pensions. There's about £3 trillion. And it's a really timely thing to be talking about, because the government is going through a big pensions review, a kind of once in a lifetime pensions review, reform of the pension sector. So talking about the connection between pensions and the climate crisis is it's really important to do that at the moment. In terms of looking at how you can individually take action, Make My Money Matter has produced lots of resources looking at different pension providers and their climate policies. Make My Money Matter actually wound up as an organisation last year, but all of their resources are still freely available online. So that's the first place you could take a look if you want to find out more information about your private pension or your workplace pension. But if you want to get involved in that wider movement of just raising the conversation about pensions and their impact on the climate crisis, because there's huge amounts of pension investments still going into fossil fuel expansion, then we have a petition you can sign at the JustMoney movement, and I'll pop something in the chat about that in a moment. And we're also about to launch an action for you to write to your MP, because the debate will be coming to the Commons in the next couple of weeks, and we want to see an amendment there to the pensions bill to include climate risk. It all gets quite technical, but it's a really, really important issue to be speaking out on, and to kind of be learning more about, joining the dots really between those of us who have pensions and the impact that might be having on the climate, but for all of us to take part in that, holding those in power to account, and trying to put forward greener legislation that will change the system as a whole. So thanks for raising the question about pensions, Nigel. There was a question there about Church of England funds and climate solutions. Claire, I wonder if that's something that you can speak to. I mean, maybe it doesn't have to be directly about Church of England if you don't have that detail, but about institutional funds. Is there anything that we can do there to ensure that more of that money is going towards climate solutions?
Yeah, thank you. No, that's a good question. I think so we know publicly from the accounts of the church commissioners of the Church of England that hold huge endowment pots, that about 7% of their 100 million or so, 10 billion, I think it is, sorry. I can never do big numbers. About 10 billion are invested in climate and environmental solutions. So that's a good start. And there is some really good practice that we can point to. But I think it does need scrutiny, and it does need individuals to keep asking those questions. And that's at a church commissioner level. Each diocese within the Church of England also has their own investments, some of them quite sizable. And there's not quite as much information available as to how much of that is invested in climate solutions. So if you are in a Church of England church, do ask those questions of your synod reps. Ask them to be flagging this and to be putting it on the agenda. And we know that from other denominations who have signed up to the Green Investment Declaration, so for instance, the Quakers came on board recently, and they have a significant amount, I think sort of 18 to 20% of their investments are currently in climate solutions. So there is real precedent and examples that you can point to of where churches are doing this. But yeah, there's a longer way to go. So as I say, I would point you to our Green Investment Declaration pages on our website that has some information about how you can kind of template letters that you can send and ask your church institutions to be considering this. And also on the 3rd of November, there's a webinar with CCLA, which is the sort of major investment manager for Church of England funds. So you can ask them questions about what their plans are for the future and for investing more in this area.
Thanks, Claire. That's really helpful. And there's various links going into the chats. Helen, there was a question that came in advance, which I think you have touched on a bit in your presentation, which is whether to achieve a Gold Eco Church Award, do we need to consider banking? Is that a really important thing to do? If we're with a kind of worst performer amongst the big high street banks, is that something that we need to be doing as part of our progress towards a Gold Eco Church Award?
Thanks, Rosie. Yes, it's a helpful question. So as I tried to explain, EcoChurch covers a vast array of areas, and it's important that churches take ownership in each of these. But we award churches and encourage them for what they're doing. So I think, it is possible, and there are awarded banks awarded churches in our midst that hold EcoChurch awards that may be banking unethically. I think that's the reality. But absolutely, we want to encourage eco churches, as they're gaining awards, to be taking far more action on this. And I think the statistics that I shared, and I know it was very brief, are showing that progression of churches engaging with money, whether that be through divestment or switching bank or positively investing in climate and nature positive solutions, that there is a moving of the dial from bronze to silver. And we would expect to see that continuing movement towards gold. We have not yet awarded any gold churches on the new survey. This is an area that, as I said, we've really strengthened in the new survey. And we're continuing to work with our gold churches. We meet with them several times a year, and this will be an important topic going forward.
Thank you, Helen. There are a few kind of practical questions I can see around switching accounts. So I'm just going to try and summarise those. So there's a question around mitigating the disruption of moving, which I know has been touched on as well, as how, if you're needing direct debits and standing orders to move across, which I understand is a real worry, particularly for smaller churches. There's a question there around whether the smaller banks can provide the services that we need, like the online and authorising demands of church accounts. So I'll touch on that in a moment, but just to come back to that kind of weighing up of when and how to switch, and maybe overcoming barriers for that, and also ethical dilemmas around local branches for banks, and whether there's access to them, and whether switching to ethical options might be really challenging for you as a local community. So there are no real easy answers here, and I'm aware that lots of churches are really grappling with this at the moment of wanting to switch to and champion more ethical and greener banks, but there are challenges. And one of the things that we want to be doing at the Just Money movement is to be raising those challenges with the smaller banks that we have really good relationships with, so that we can say to them, these are some of the difficulties that churches are facing in switching. For example, I know some small churches really struggle to open accounts with the Co-op bank because they're not registered charities, they're accepted charities because of their size and their turnover. And that's something that we are advocating on at the moment. And I know that there are other concerns that you have. So I don't have easy answers, but I would encourage you to share your challenges with us so that, again, we can raise those with the churches involved. And Claire wants to jump in and say something here.
Yeah, I just wanted to share a tip that I've picked up from conversations with various churches that have switched, which is that if you switch alongside a stewardship appeal, it can be quite a good opportunity to ask people to renew a standing order or set one up for the first time, and then they'd have to fill in the form anyway. So it's a way of sort of reducing the burden on them to sort of take on the administrative activity of changing their standing order. And I know that I was talking with one church in particular recently that was saying that they switched banks and did a stewardship campaign at the same time, and they saw a big uptick in their giving because people hadn't been asked for a couple of years to review their giving, and actually they saw a big increase in income for the church at the same time as being able to sort of send this really positive messaging about how, as part of their eco-church journey, they're switching to a green bank. So it was a win-win on both sides. So actually it doesn't always have to be something to be afraid of. While it does involve people filling in a form, if you do it as part of a wider campaign and really big up the environmental potential as well, then it can be quite an easy and good thing to do.
Yeah, thanks, Claire. And of course, we've got the Caroline's example was the first step to take was to move the savings account and deposit account, and that might be the place to start and to have the conversation, and then moving your business account, your day-to-day accounts might come a little bit later down the line. But I think having the conversations, I think is a really important thing to do as part of that wider awareness raising, part of that encouragement for everyone to be thinking, even as individuals, as households, about their own banking. If the church is starting to have those conversations, then it's encouraging others to start thinking about that too. And there are many, many more options open for individuals, and it's much, much easier and swifter for an individual to switch their current account, as we found through the big bank switch. So just encourage you to start those conversations and to reach out if we can support you in having those conversations. So do use the Greener Fairer Banking Guide if you want to share with your church treasurers. We compare the different services that the different banks offer, and that's often where people want to start, is actually can that bank provide what we need? And as we've talked about, and as Helen mentioned, that speaking out and campaigning is a really important part of this as well. So engaging with your current bank, if you're not quite at the point that you can switch, or if you're about to switch, is raising that with them, talking about the reasons why you're wanting to switch away from them. Really important to do that too. Let's just have a little check to see if we have the others that we haven't covered yet. Who else has just come in? Oh, really good question from Tom, a big question. Do you think divestment of this sort works? I.e., will it influence the banks? Is it really about us banking in accordance with our beliefs? I wonder if, Claire, you might be able to pick that up from an investment side, and then I'm happy to pick it up from the banking side first.
Yeah, sure. It is a really big question, and I think that it's something that churches have historically sort of struggled with, thinking about, well, do we engage with fossil fuel companies and try and get them to be more Paris aligned, or do we divest our money? And I think that most churches have now opted to do the latter because engagement hasn't worked. And as we've seen in my slides earlier, the increased expansion of fossil fuel companies' activities in recent years and the amounts of billions that are being invested in that just shows that the tide isn't turning fast enough. There was a moral stance of standing up and saying we don't want to use our money to support and fund the destruction of God's creation, is an important stand to take based on our beliefs. But then I think it can have a ripple effect as well. And I'm always really encouraged by the story of the URC. So the URC divested, but had, I think, about £200,000 in a shared pooled account with other churches and charities. And they went to their fund manager and said, oh, we want to divest this £200,000 from fossil fuels. And they said, oh, well, we'll have to ask everybody else, all the other clients that have pooled together their money into your investment fund, if they want to divest as well. And they did. Everyone said, well, yeah, sure, we will too. And then it amounted to over £1 billion in total that was taken out of fossil fuels. So that sort of ripple effect can happen if you take a stance as an individual church. You can really sort of see a bigger change happen, and that sort of change can really influence markets and public's perception. So I think it's worth doing on both fronts.
Yeah, and I just add to that on banking. So at Just Money Movement, we're involved in encouraging people to switch, but also involved on the engagement, the shareholder action, investor engagement with banks as well. So we do see those two things as working really well together. I think there's a reputational risk for banks with people moving en masse away from them. There's the importance of championing and drawing attention to the need for an ethical banking sector and to get behind that. So that's part of the kind of moving the money. And I think that there are banks within the kind of those what we don't call like the worst performers around climate there's a spectrum there. So there are banks within there who are and the which research identifies this that are moving more in the right direction. So it might be that it's those banks we want to focus on to shift them. And we're thinking about how we do that through the big bank switch, for example. Nationwide has recently acquired Virgin Money, which has some fossil fuel financing exposure. Nationwide, we've previously described as a green bank, but now there's a question for us now about their ownership of Virgin Money. So we'll be writing to them, we'll be encouraging other people to write to them. So there's those actions that we can take for those banks that have made the commitments and are moving in the right direction, but to really encourage them. But I think when it comes to the biggest banks, then it's going to be regulation and legal action that will be putting the pressure on and will force those banks to act. So it kind of needs all of these parts of the movement for greener banking to be active and to be working together. And I think it's for you as individuals and churches to work out and discern where can we most have an impact and where do we want to be involved. It might be a number of those different things, but really encourage you to kind of explore all the different things that you might be able to do. So we're coming near to the end. I'm just going to see if there's any further question, or is there anything else, Helen, that you want to draw attention to before we wrap up? There are some more technical questions about banking, which I may try and follow up with, put something in the email afterwards, and kind of maybe pull some things out of the banking guide that will help with that rather than delve too much into those details now. But do look back up the chat because people have also been adding their own experience and really helpful comments as well. So thank you for those who have been adding their own experiences of how you've overcome barriers. That's been really helpful.
Rosie, maybe if I can just add briefly to the end of what you and Claire were just saying in relation to Tom's question, and also picking up on what Caroline said. I think, Caroline, you said that this is an area that you feel quite passionately about, and there'll be people in our churches who've got different interests and passions. You know, they may be coming at this from a justice perspective, they may be coming at it, they really care about access to food in our society and so on. Actually, some of the stories of what some of the more ethical banks are doing in the ways that they are investing money. I'm thinking particularly of Triodos, which is one I'm a bit more familiar with. There are such great stories on there of how they are making a positive difference using money that we are investing through banking with them, saving with them. So it might be another route in to help make this vast area of money more accessible to people. You know, everyone will have an interest in something that eventually will lead them to money. So considerations.
Yeah, thank you. And again, there's a couple more questions coming in about technicalities and switching to the co-op. I really encourage you to email us at info@justmoney.org.uk if there are specific examples you have of not being able to access banks and not being able to switch, because we have been supporting churches to kind of gather evidence around. So we want to basically know how many churches this is affecting and what are the particular barriers that you're facing. So yeah, please would encourage you to be in touch so that we can gather more of that evidence, and particularly in relation to the co-op, we can go back to them and talk to them about any challenges that you are facing. But yeah, and just to pick up the question around the two signatory systems. So the 4 banks that we look at in the Greener Fairer Banking Guide, CAF Bank, Co-op Bank, Reliance Bank and Unity Trust Bank, do all offer dual authorization. But again, if you're having difficulties, please reach out directly to the bank itself if you're a customer already, but to us if it's a bank that you're wanting to switch to, so that we can collate that information. And if you have stories to share of your switches as churches or other things that you're doing, perhaps investments and things that you're exploring, it's really, really good for us to hear those stories and share those stories. I think each of us speakers on the call would really welcome hearing your experiences. Really quite hard for us sometimes to gather those stories because people don't think that they've done very much. When you've switched a church account, you might not feel that's something that you particularly want to talk about and share the story of. But I hope, as you've seen through what Caroline shared today, it is actually really helpful to hear those experiences, and it guides and assists and inspires others. Claire.
There was just a question that came through about churches with accepted status,
Mhm.
and I just wondered if we have a moment left to answer that one, because my understanding is that if you have accepted status, so you don't have to register with the Charity Commission, you still can access charity banking because you can have some information from your diocese, a code or something. Rosie, you might know more about that.
Yeah, it does depend very much on whether your denomination has an arrangement. So the Methodist Church, for example, has an arrangement, particularly with the co-op, because they've had issues there. I know that some dioceses are exploring that for very small accepted churches that within the Church of England. So yeah, there are, I think, amongst the banks that are set up for community and smaller organisations and charities, there'll be a willingness to provide services. It's just with some of the bigger banks, they don't always understand the structure of churches. They don't understand what the different roles are, what a PCC is, what a trustee is. So sometimes it's about the language. But I am aware that there have been some difficulties there, particularly around registered charity status. We are going to wind up there so we can finish on time, but I do have a very quick feedback poll, which I'd really encourage all of you to complete. I'm going to put it onto the slide now, onto the screen now, and just a couple more slides to highlight things that you can be involved with later this week and ways that you can stay in touch. So let me just launch the poll first and give you a chance to fill that in before you leave. There we go. And if we could just have the slides back up for the last couple just before we finish. So if you have started to get excited about the potential for investing in a fairer, greener world, we do have a webinar tomorrow lunchtime as part of Good Money Week. This is more for individuals who are interested in greener investing, but may well be of interest to churches too. We have FX Energize Africa and Community Energy England coming to talk to us about different ways to invest for positive change, particularly with a climate lens. So lots of, again, very practical ways in which you could take action. So I'd encourage you to come along and join us for that. As we've mentioned earlier in the webinar, it's also Good Money Week and it's Good Money Sunday. This Sunday, you may still be writing your sermon, perhaps, I don't know, preparing prayers. There are lots of resources available on the website that you could download and to assist you in sparking conversations about greener finance. And you're really welcome to use those throughout the year. If it's too short notice to use them this Sunday, please do use them. And as Claire said, there's lots of resources available on Operation Noah's website and a vast range of resources available through EcoChurch to help you start to pray and act and have these conversations. And so I thought I'd finish just with an encouragement to pray. There's been so much to digest in today's webinar, so much information, so many possibilities and stories, and potentially challenges and frustrations. So an encouragement to pray. I pray for any and all of these things to help all of us see the connections between our faith and our finances, to explore some of the resources that you've heard of today, to follow the links, to share with others, but yeah, most importantly, to pray and to discern, to discover what your next steps might be. And I'll just close the webinar by this final prayer, which comes from some of the big bank switch resources. Lord God, yours is the earth and everything in it. You love the world with justice and challenge us to live justly. Help us to use the resources you have given us wisely and for the good of all your creation. Amen. Thank you very much to Helen, to Claire, to Caroline, to all who've been involved in organising today's webinar. And thank you so much to all of you for joining us. All the best in your journeys towards taking greener financial choices. Please do stay in touch and let us know how you get on. Goodbye.